Cities are uniquely positioned to restore the lost half of life on Earth and lift billions of people out of poverty. But doing so requires innovation at scale against incredible resistance, the core skill set of at least some billionaires. So should cities coddle the billionaires with tax breaks and other incentives? In today's episode, I'll argue that the answer is no. Today we'll talk about the promise of cities, the billionaire niche, the billionaire problem, actually there's 3 of them, and solutions to this problem for nations and for cities. Welcome to Edenicity, best practices for sustainably abundant cities. We've occupied half the land on Earth and wiped out half the life on Earth. But cities occupy just 3% of the land, while housing more than half the world's population. It stands to reason that if we can meet more of our needs in cities, we can take the burden off of the large landscapes and ecologies that we've largely destroyed and begin to rehabilitate them. The strategy for this is what I call Edenicity, a combination of permaculture and urbanism. Permaculture is a system of ecological home and farm design with about 1 million certified designers worldwide. Urbanism is the human-centered design of large-scale systems in cities, including energy, transport, housing, water, sanitation, recreation, and services. In over 100 episodes on this channel, I've shown how food and energy-secure cities would make room for environmental restoration and offer greater convenience, safety, and health. In other words, they would compete in the market for places to live. But moving existing cities in the direction of the Edenicity model faces stiff resistance, both from people who don't want anything new built in their backyard to entrenched commercial interests. Overcoming resistance to produce value at scale is the peculiar skill set of many but not all of today's billionaires. Tesla and SpaceX, for example, disrupted regulated, incumbent-dominated industries that had successfully resisted change for decades. So it's really no surprise that on this channel I've mentioned a number of ideas that Elon Musk in particular has suggested over the years, and this garnered a bit of pushback from my viewers. So I ended up writing a fairly detailed post, which I've linked in the description below, that discusses Elon Musk's career at length and basically comes to the conclusion that while it's important to encourage innovation, nations really need to regulate and restrain our innovators as well. Today I'm going to go a lot deeper into this concept because I think there are still a lot of misconceptions. Here's a fairly detailed response to my post. The commenter said, while we can certainly value what his companies have achieved, could those companies have achieved that without him? That is to say, many of these companies, Tesla, SpaceX, SolarCity, PayPal, etc., had existed before Elon Musk joined or bought them, in which case, which of their technologies that we praise existed before Elon got to them? Tesla was already making electric cars, SpaceX was already making rockets, and so forth. So what did Elon actually do? This part I'm going to quibble with strongly. Should we be giving the praise of these developments to their engineers or the guy who just bought them? The commenter then goes on to say, billionaires shouldn't exist at all, but if we have billionaires, they should be advancing the human race, going to Mars, investing in renewable energy, EVs, etc. But while that sounds great, once you realize how much even $1 billion is, you see how much money is not part of the economy, how much is not being invested by governments into research or education due to these billionaires not paying taxes, etc. I totally agree with this, and we're going to amplify this in this episode. How many of these hoarders of wealth, these leeches, have stifled our collective efforts? I'm going to very strongly quibble with that, just by limiting the amount of money flowing through the economy. Yes. What could we have had? How many amazing technologies have we missed out on? Point is, without Musk and Bezos, etc., we would still have development and progress. It would just be more spread out. So again, what does Musk actually do? All right, so I think it's fair to say that a lot of people are really mad or at least very disappointed in Elon Musk since his acquisition of Twitter, now X.com. Just by way of example, let's take a closer look at that one on the right, which was carefully critiqued by Kareem Carr, statistician. So Musk reposted this graphic that showed black on white violence being much greater than white on black violence. And his comment was, odd, why should the media misrepresent the real situation to such an extreme degree? So Kareem Carr then breaks it down piece by piece, going back to the original data set, and eventually shows this graph here, which I think really summarizes what was misleading and deceptive about the original graph. The issue is that in the United States, at least, the majority of the population is white. And so it would make sense that the majority of both victims and perpetrators of crime would also be white, other things being equal. And indeed, that's what we see in the complete data set, which includes white-on-white violence, which is by far the biggest bar on the graph. So it stands to reason that the thing that was misleading was not some vague media trend, but that original graphic that Elon Musk posted uncritically. And for somebody as numerate as Musk, this is just crushingly disappointing. So anger is a very justifiable emotion to walk into a discussion of Elon Musk, if not billionaires as a whole. And to be fair, there are billionaires who do just buy up large enterprises and consolidate them in the name of administrative efficiency and then just squeeze the value out of them to the detriment of both customers who are now facing big monopolies and employees, many of whom, especially in, for example, hospital IT departments, end up downsized. So there's a lot to despise about those billionaires who do just buy up and squeeze value out of things. But that's not the kind of billionaire that Elon Musk was, at least not until he bought Twitter. Tesla did exist before Musk got a hold of it, but their production amounted to about 100 prototypes before he became CEO, and then ramped up to the millions of sales that the company has racked up since then. SpaceX absolutely did not exist in any way, shape, or form before it began as a dream in Elon Musk's head. See the biographies in the description below for details. I lived and worked in LA at the end of the 90s, when a lot of people were subscribing to Make Magazine and building their own electric cars. I've met several of them myself. I also got to know several employees and a founder at T0, which was kind of a precursor to Tesla. And I can tell you that the industry was nowhere near thinking about mass production until Tesla came along, and nowhere near being able to actually do it until Elon Musk took over the helm. As for space, well, that was my real passion. I went to grad school with this guy and was his snorkeling buddy before he was hired by the astronaut corps. I had an outreach role on the Mars Pathfinder mission and an instrument role on the Mars Polar Lander. And since middle school, have been an avid fan, follower, and eventually detractor of the space shuttle program because of its enormous promise and crushing disappointment. Here was the vehicle that was supposed to give us routine weekly access to space at a cost of $200 per pound delivered to orbit, which actually flew about twice a year at a cost of a little over $20,000 per pound. When I was working in the space industry in LA in the late 90s, it was obvious to everyone that the industry was stuck and that none of us had the formula yet to break out of it. I actually worked at a company called Microcosm, which is where Elon Musk hired Hans Koenigsmann, who I mentioned in my post, and Gwynne Shotwell, who's been the president of SpaceX since practically the beginning. Full disclosure, she was hired in after I left. We never crossed paths. So SpaceX is something else. What they've done is nothing short of a miracle from my perspective. And it would not have happened at all. We would not be anywhere near where we are currently in space if it were not for Musk. Here's a graphic from The Visual Capitalist that really lays it out in stark terms. The vertical axis shows the price per kilogram delivered to low Earth orbit on a variety of different rockets, including the Saturn V that brought Apollo astronauts to the moon, the Soyuz, the Russian equivalent, the space shuttle up here at over $51,000 per kilogram to orbit, and other vehicles such as the Delta Heavy, which was a workhorse for decades. And then we get to SpaceX's accomplishments. When they began commercial operations, they were right at par with the Delta Heavy, and then fairly quickly brought the prices down with the Falcon 9 by a factor of 4, making it by far the lowest cost, high reliability way into space. And they did this, of course, through reusability. The Falcon Heavy continued this trend, which is an astonishing 30 times cheaper than the space shuttle. They're actually aiming for $200 per kilogram. That's twice as good as the original promise of the shuttle, even before inflation. Now, obviously, Starship has not been delivered yet, so the real answer is probably going to be somewhere between these two, but already SpaceX has delivered an absolute breakthrough in space access that many people my age were beginning to despair we would not see in our lifetimes. So to summarize, some billionaires can be very aggravating. Some billionaires roll up hospitals and squeeze the value out of them at the cost of outcomes for patients. But there are a significant number of people who became billionaires through massive innovation. That raises the question, how should cities that need enormous amounts of innovation relate to billionaires? There's actually a three-pronged problem that billionaires pose to cities and, frankly, to nations. All three problems stem from a winner-take-all market evangelism that has engulfed the United States. And if you really want to geek out on this concept, there's a book that I've put in the description called The Big Myth that actually explains in painstaking detail how this came to be. Although I should warn you that if this is not already aligned with your political beliefs, the book will be very annoying because they start with their opinions and then build the evidence a few pages later. Anyway, the first problem with winner-take-all market evangelism is this attitude of, I earned it, let me keep it. What we're talking about here is tax breaks that deplete and destabilize the public sphere. Let's dig into the data. All right, here's the U.S. budget, surplus and deficit since 1930. And as you can see, we ran up a humongous deficit during the World War II years, and then recovered to a period of relative stability through the mid-1970s. Then things get noticeably less stable, and we find ourselves in this strange position today where there's tremendous pressure from half the government to cut spending, and the richest nation on earth is made to feel like we don't have enough money for things like high-speed rail or single-payer healthcare, or other basic amenities that many other much poorer nations have enjoyed for decades. In the US today, these feelings are palpable on the street, in part because we've watched productivity double since the 1980s, but wages increase only about 37%. So the area between these two curves is all the money that hardworking people in the country produced that went into the pockets of a very few rich people. And it's led to an epidemic of quiet quitting, where people basically do the absolute minimum they need to keep their jobs, but not enough to really be promoted because they really don't believe that a promotion would be forthcoming no matter how hard they worked. In addition, in the US, many people, young men in particular, are just filling time in their corporate jobs and working on a side hustle until they can start to earn rewards that are at least proportional to the effort that they put into their business, since they certainly weren't getting that in their jobs, as this graph shows. But here's the problem with that. This is a graph of the U.S. corporate tax rates, highest and lowest brackets, from 1934 to the present. And as you can see, it was fairly progressive, meaning that there was quite a range between the tax rates paid by the smallest and the largest companies until quite recently. In 2017, Congress passed a massive tax cut for the big companies and a massive tax increase for small companies. So for those of us who have quietly quit the workforce and tried to start up our own companies on the side, what's happened is our taxes have gone up by 30%, and that money has basically gone right into the pockets of the biggest companies that got a 40% tax break at the same time. And just so you know who voted for this, you can see that the overwhelming majority of Republicans voted for it in both houses of Congress, and 0 Democrats voted for it in both houses of Congress. But wait, there's more. In the US, individual tax brackets were astoundingly high earlier in the century. During the 1950s, which in the Reagan era were considered the really good old days, the top tax bracket was an almost inconceivable 90% or more. But during the 1980s, as you can see, the tax structure became much flatter, becoming almost flat in the late 1980s, never to fully recover their former very progressive nature. Finally, let's take a look at the U.S. income tax receipts as a percentage of GDP from individuals and corporations. To me, the thing that's striking is that in the 1930s, individuals and corporations both contributed equally, but somewhere during World War II, taxation overall increased, never to fall back to its former level, at least for individuals. Isn't it amazing how the individual income taxes have continued to go up slightly, while the corporate income taxes have fallen by a factor of 4 since those glory days of the 1950s. Okay, for you screenshot maniacs, here are those 4 graphs in one place. And here's an alternate view. And I just couldn't resist showing the different presidential administrations superimposed on the budget deficit graph. It's not completely cut and dry, but go ahead and draw your own conclusions. This has had real costs to average Americans. The increased deficits brought on by the 2017 tax cuts add up to $1.7 trillion, or about $5,000 per U.S. citizen. Now, just to be clear, these policies did not come out of nowhere. They were the result of lots of money being spent by lobbyists, the most recent of which are the crypto corporations, which have contributed about 48% of all political spending in the 2024 campaigns. This, according to Public Citizen, the consumer watchdog founded by Ralph Nader. Okay, now you may well ask what this has to do with cities. Well, cities and states have spent a lot of money trying to attract bigger employers in the form of tax breaks and in some cases outright grants to workers in specific industries. And as I've pointed out several times on this channel, this is basically a race to the bottom because this pulls money out of local treasuries that would be available for public amenities and just basically gives it to the corporations, that is to say to the billionaires who own substantial equity stakes in these corporations. The bottom line, once again, is that by pulling money out of the public sphere, somewhere between the mid-1950s and now, we made a mistake that rewarded billionaires and hurt the average person and destabilize government spending. That's the cost of the winner-take-all attitude of, I earned it, let me keep it. The next attitude is, I'm more valuable than you, which is basically when you've got a powerful group of people that feel they have no shared destiny with everyone else. And the problem with that is that this also has direct costs in terms of public amenity, safety, and health. A few years back, Douglas Rushkoff was invited to give a keynote to a group of hedge fund managers who were concerned about surviving doomsday. They were doing things like building bunkers and buying entire islands in distant Pacific archipelagos. And they wanted to know from a well-established academic futurist what they can do to improve their odds of survival. To me, the thing that's remarkable is, first of all, they thought that despite their enormous power, they did not have the ability to head off complete disaster for everybody. And second, that if there was a disaster, that they could somehow also use what money and power they had to avoid it. So it's a remarkable combination of a feeling of powerlessness in the domain of helping people and powerfulness in the domain of helping themselves that has shaped their attitude. But our destinies are indeed shared, whether we want to admit it or not. When we embrace that shared destiny, we can create a much higher standard of living for all of us, regardless of income. In my book, Housing in Four Cities, see the link below, I quote a statement from Hawaii State Senator Stanley Chang, who closed out a discussion of the integration of different modes of transit in Hong Kong with the following statement. The seamless integration was really remarkable when we visited Olympian City during the 2019 delegation. We were in the 86th floor penthouse of one of the West Kowloon residential towers, a beautiful multi-million-dollar home. From there, you could take an elevator into the lobby, which directly exits into the mall. From the mall, you could take an escalator to the Airport Express train to catch your flight to San Francisco or Hawaii. You are completely sealed in a climate-controlled bubble. You never have to cross the street or wait for a red light. You never leave the air conditioning, and it doesn't matter if there's a typhoon outside. It was so fast and convenient and efficient that the Singapore chairman of Sinoland, their development company, doesn't want a car and driver at the airport. He would rather drag his own suitcase through this network of bridges and tunnels because it's so much faster and more convenient and cheaper. Now, just to give you a sense of how much safer public transportation is than private cars, let me show you this graph from the National Safety Council of the fatalities due to the different modes of transportation on the deaths per 100 million passenger miles. Notice that passenger vehicles dominate this graph. Buses, much less so. Railroads, somewhat more than buses. And scheduled airlines, hardly at all. Passenger vehicle deaths were 50 times higher than for buses, 17 times higher than for trains, and 1,000 times higher than for scheduled airlines. Large-scale regulated industries have proven dramatically safer than private cars. Now, this may all be a little bit abstract, so let's go to the tabloids and see a more human face of what I'm talking about here. This is a picture of Denmark's Crown Prince Frederik, now King Frederik, as of earlier this year, bicycling his daughter to kindergarten. And here's a picture of Prince Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands, now King of the Netherlands, bicycling his children to school. The point being that really good public infrastructure is not for any one social status or income level in society. If it's built right, it serves everybody. And the final face of the winner-take-all market evangelism is the attitude of I'm smarter, so put me in charge. And we see this in Elon Musk's ongoing feud with the FAA, which has been fining him for endangering the areas surrounding his spaceport with his launches and for failing to obey requirements to postpone launches due to questionable weather. Basically, Musk has gone on record in many venues as saying that the FAA is flawed and should be restructured, and he's tried to position himself as a sort of efficiency czar in a potential future Trump administration. This would be a huge mistake. Again, going back to this graph, scheduled airlines account for less than 1,000th as many fatalities per passenger mile as cars. And Musk's main experience with passengers is overwhelmingly in the automotive industry. If it comes to a conflict between Musk and the FAA, I'm going to believe the FAA. What can nations and cities do about the billionaire problem? In the US, the answer is simple: restore progressive taxation to stabilize the public sphere. The evidence is pretty compelling that we had greater stability and more money to spend on public amenities that serve everyone when we had a more progressive tax structure. In addition, we should repeal Citizens United, which has led to a corporate capture of government. By corporate capture, I refer you to this article from the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance, which has presented in a very brief way some compelling evidence that we're already living in a country that's been fully captured by private corporations. There's evidence that crypto is really destabilizing the electoral process. Citizens United put a ton of billionaire money into politics, and recent rulings have shielded wealthy donors from laws at the state level requiring that the public have access to who's putting all this money into campaigning and lobbying efforts. So now they're not only allowed to pour unlimited amounts of money into buying political campaigns, but they're allowed to do it in secret. And so, not too surprisingly, Democrats have introduced a constitutional amendment to reverse Citizens United. And of course, in the current Congress, it's not going anywhere. All right, for cities and states, we need to turn the race to the bottom into a race to the top. And we can do this by ending the practice of giving tax breaks to corporations to try to lure large employers, and investing in public amenities and services such as transit, housing, energy, food, health, and education. Because everyone wants to live and work in a place where they can thrive. So by investing in the public sphere, cities can most effectively become the places where the workers want to be and where the companies will follow. And I'll actually have a brief example of that in the next episode. Thanks as always to my wonderful patrons for supporting this channel financially. To learn more about Edenicity, check out these videos here. If you like what you're seeing, be sure to leave a like. And if you see that white subscribe button, go ahead and gently tap that so that we can connect again in the future. Take care, stay green, see you next time.